Okay, so today we're going to be looking at the biological explanations of OCD. First, we're going to be looking at the genetic explanations. Most of evidence comes from family and twin studies, and it's shown there's been a strong link for the disorder. People with first-degree relatives, a parent or sibling with OCD, have a 5 times greater risk of having the illness. And identical twins, so they have exactly the same genetics, are more than twice as likely to develop OCD if their twins had OCD. Also, there's a variation in a gene called the CMOT gene, and it has been identified that it is different in people with OCD. So this suggests that OCD runs in families, although what is most likely is that it's a vulnerability to develop OCD. Is actually the thing that's inherited. So vulnerability is a susceptibility. So you're carrying the gene, but unless the right environmental situation occurs, then you won't develop OCD. This suggests that there's quite a few mental disorders that have vulnerability to the disorder and are not purely genetic. We call this the diathesis stress model. So let's have a further look at the actual evidence. First, we've got a couple of candidate genes which create this vulnerability for OCD. And some of these genes are involved in the regulation of serotonin. We'll look at serotonin in a bit. OCD is a polygenic disorder. That means that we don't think it's caused by one. In fact, we know it's not caused by one single gene. In actual fact, for example, Taylor says it could be caused by up to 230 genes. All tend to be associated with the neurotransmitters serotonin and dopamine. There are also different types of OCD, and it's just thought these different types of OCD all have different genes that may be responsible for that OCD, and we call this etiological heterogeneity. So, evaluation of genetics. Let's have a look. Is there any evidence? There is some good supporting evidence. Nest et al. 2000 looked at 80 patients with OCD and 340 of their near relatives compared with the control group. And they found a really strong link. 5 times greater risk if they had a first-degree relative of developing OCD. Another meta-analysis of 14 twin studies found on average monozygotic twins are 2 times more likely to develop the disorder than dizygotic twins. And the concordance rates are really quite high, 87%. However, they're never 100%, which means that we cannot say that OCD is entirely genetic. Other problem is there are so many candidate genes. Remember, we said there was about 230, that even if there was a genetic explanation, it's very unlikely that we could do anything about it by manipulating the genes or affecting the genes, as it would have no predictive value. And lastly, the environmental risk factors. Kramer found that over half of sufferers of OCD had experienced some traumatic event in their past. So that suggests it cannot be entirely genetic and must be more likely to be a vulnerability that's inherited. And when the right environmental situation comes along, then the person will develop OCD. So we're going to be looking at neural explanations here, specifically the role of serotonin. We looked at serotonin when we were looking at the biological approach. Let me just remind you about what happens when a nerve impulse. Remember, it's called an action potential. Action potential, or your electrical impulse, travels down your axon, the long tube bit here. Right? It stimulates the vesicles, which are full of the neurotransmitter. In this case, we're going to be talking about serotonin, so these little pink things are serotonin. They are released, or stimulated to be released in the vesicles by this action potential into the synapse. They travel across the synapse and are collected by specific receptors for them. And then that stimulates another further action potential to move down the next axon and so forth. The serotonin is then taken up by the uptake pumps, the serotonin uptake pumps, taken back into the vesicles, and the whole process starts again. Now, someone with OCD has less serotonin that is able to travel across the synaptic cleft. Because the serotonin is allowing the cells to communicate, their brain doesn't communicate effectively, and that can develop these feelings of OCD. In some cases, people with OCD, they have impaired decision making, and this is actually associated with damage to the frontal lobes, which are here and here, and they are the areas of your brain which are responsible for thinking and making decisions. They're just behind your forehead. There's also evidence to suggest that the parohippocampus gyrus, which is in here somewhere, okay, is also associated with unpleasant emotions and functions which are abnormal in OCD. What's actually happening is the parts of the brain circuit are damaged in people with OCD, so inappropriate impulses get through and they're overwhelmed with these troublesome thoughts and actions, and this is what's going to lead to their impaired decision making. Right, let's have a look, evaluate the neural explanation. There is some supporting evidence. This comes from the use of serotonin selectate reuptake inhibitors. That's a drug, and it increases the amount of serotonin in between the cell. Scans also show OCD sufferers have low levels of serotonin, and after taking the SSRIs, those PET scans show a return to normal levels of serotonin. It's also found in cases of people with Tourette's and Parkinson's disease, which you already know are disorders of which the basal ganglia, which is that little bit we looked at earlier, it's in the middle here, okay, is implicated. It's not clear, however, which are exactly involved, and we should not assume that neuromechanisms cause OCD, and that OCD hasn't caused neuromechanisms to be damaged. So we're not sure of cause and effect, basically. But it is a lot of promising research, but hasn't yet offered a complete explanation. We do need to be aware that one of the most powerful challenges to this view is that the psychological interventions show a strong therapeutic effect. There's a lot of CBT done with people with OCD and has a really, really good effect. So although it seems like there's a lot of evidence of the fact that it has a biological explanation, we also need to take into account that there is a psychological explanation for it as well.